My daughter and her husband were hosting my retirement celebration when my wife grabbed my sleeve and pulled me into the hallway. She didn't say anything at first. She just held up her phone and said, quietly, "Lead this." I thought she was joking. I almost laughed. I wasn't laughing 30 seconds later. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working for the same engineering firm in Kitchener, Ontario. I started as a junior estimator fresh out of Waterloo, walked through every level they had, and retired as regional director of infrastructure projects. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you because it matters. Because everything that happened, everything that almost happened, started with money. With the kind of money that changes people you thought you knew. My wife and I'll call her my wife because that's what she is and has been for 38 years. We were not rich when we married. We were careful. She worked as a dental hygienist for 26 years. I worked my hours. We bought a modest house in Waterloo when the kids were small, drove used cars until they stopped running, and took family vacations to Muskoka instead of Europe. Not because we couldn't eventually afford Europe, but because that wasn't who we were. By the time I retired, we had paid off the house, had a healthy RRSP, and owned a small rented property in Cambridge that my wife managed. Not wealthy. Comfortable. Canadian comfortable, which means you don't talk about it. Our daughter, I'll call her our daughter, is 37. She married her husband 8 years ago. He seemed fine to me when they started dating. Eager, maybe a little too eager. The kind of man who laughs slightly too hard at your jokes and remembers details about you in a way that always felt like homework rather than affection. But she loved him. She was happy. That was enough for me. The retirement party was her idea. She insisted on hosting it at their house in Cambridge, a newer build in a subdivision I could never afford at her age, which I found out later they had significantly over-mortgaged. She planned everything. Catered food from a place in Guelph. A custom cake. She'd even framed a photograph of me standing outside the original firm office on my first day in 1993, which made me feel old and moved at the same time. My son, who lives in Vancouver, flew in. Some of my old colleagues came. My wife's sister drove up from Hamilton. It was a full house. Warm in the way that retirement parties can be when you've actually earned the retirement. I was standing near the sliding doors to the back deck, talking to my old project manager, when my wife appeared at my elbow. She didn't interrupt. She waited until there was a pause, and then she touched my arm and tilted her head toward the hallway. I followed her because in 38 years I have learned that when she tilts her head like that, she's not asking. She closed the hallway bathroom door behind us. The party noise became muffled. She handed me her phone. It was an email. She had been using their shared family computer in the home office to print the schedule for the following week. Something about a hockey carpool involving her grandchildren. And the browser had been left open on her son-in-law's email account. She hadn't gone looking for anything. The email was just there, open, the most recent one in the chain. I read it, then I read it again. My son-in-law had been corresponding with a lawyer in Mississauga about my wife's and my estate. Specifically about our will. Specifically about a version of ours that I had never signed and did not recognize. The email from the lawyer referenced the revised documentation and asked him to confirm the notarization date, and my son-in-law had replied, "The signatures are handled. We just need the property transfer completed before the old man officially processes the retirement accounts." The old man. I was standing in my daughter's bathroom holding my wife's phone, reading an email that described me as the old man, and I could hear people laughing on the other side of the door because they were waiting to toast my 31 years of service. I looked at my wife. She was watching my face the way she watches the weather. Calmly, already prepared for whatever was coming. "How long have you had this?" I said. 5 minutes. "Did you read all of it?" "I read enough." I scrolled up in the email chain. There were 11 messages going back 4 months. The lawyer's name was on the thread. There were references to a notary in Burlington. There were references to our Cambridge rental property specifically, and to what was described as a power of attorney transfer that would take effect in the event of cognitive decline or incapacitation. I am 64 years old, and I do not have cognitive decline. I had never been approached about a power of attorney by anyone. I handed the phone back to my wife. I put both hands flat on the edge of the sink and looked at myself in the mirror for a moment. "We don't say anything tonight," my wife said. "Not a question." "No," I said. "Not to wish me a happy holiday. Not thanked out to the party. I finish my conversations. I ate the catered food. I cut the cake. I gave a short speech about gratitude and the good fortune of working with people you respect, and I meant almost all of it. My son-in-law stood at the edge of the room with a glass of wine and smiled at me the same way he always had. And I smiled back, and I have never felt so entirely alone at a party in my life. That night, after my wife's sister had gone back to Hamilton and our son had taken a cab to his hotel and the last of the neighbors had left, my wife and I sat at our kitchen table in Waterloo with the lights low and talked until 2 in the morning. She had taken screenshots of the entire email chain before closing the browser. She had the sense to do that while I was still talking to my old project manager. 38 years and she still manages to be 3 steps ahead of me when it counts. We went through it carefully. The revised will mentioned in the emails had us leaving the rental property and a substantial portion of the RRSP directly to our daughter and son-in-law as joint beneficiaries, bypassing our actual will, which split everything between our daughter and our son, with a portion set aside for our 2 grandchildren's education. The power of attorney documentation would give our son-in-law authority over our finances if either of us was declared incapacitated. We had not been declared incapacitated. We had not signed any revised will. We had not engaged any lawyer in Mississauga. Someone had done it for us, or had at least begun the process of doing it for us. I spent most of that night trying to find an explanation that wasn't the obvious one. I told my wife there must be a misunderstanding. I told her maybe our daughter had been trying to do something thoughtful and handled it badly. I told her the email was probably about something else and we were reading it wrong. My wife let me talk. She let me work through it. She poured me a second cup of tea and she waited. "It's not a misunderstanding," she said when I finally stopped. I knew that. I had known it from the moment I read the old man in that email chain. But knowing something and accepting it are different processes, and some processes take longer than others. "I need to see our actual will," I said. The next morning I called our family lawyer. We'd used the same firm in Waterloo for 20 years and asked her to pull our file and confirm the current documentation on record. She called back within the hour. Our will was intact and unchanged. No amendments, no codicils. But she flagged something that made my stomach drop. There had been a request 6 weeks earlier from a third party claiming to represent us, asking for a certified copy of our property records. The firm had not complied. They don't release information to third parties without direct client confirmation. But they had logged the request. The request had come from a law office in Mississauga. I thanked her and asked her not to do anything yet. Then I called a former colleague of mine, a man who had transitioned from construction law into estate fraud work about 10 years ago, and told him what we had. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Send me the screenshots." We met him the following week in his office in Guelph. He went through everything methodically. The email chain, the reference to a notary in Burlington, the property transfer language. He explained to us that what appeared to be underway was an attempt to establish fraudulent documentation, forged or impersonated signatures on estate planning instruments, in order to redirect assets prior to or following my death or incapacitation. He used the word fraud plainly and without hesitation, which I appreciated, because I had been spending a week trying to find softer language for it and there wasn't any. The motive was not complicated. Our rental property in Cambridge had increased significantly in value. We bought it in 2004 and the market had been what it had been. Combined with the retirement accounts, we were talking about an estate value that apparently someone had decided was worth the risk. "Do you want to involve your daughter in this conversation?" he asked. My wife and I looked at each other. "Not yet," I said. That was the hardest part. Not the legal complexity, not the financial exposure, but the question of our daughter. Because she was in that house. She was married to that man. She had planned my retirement party. She had framed the photograph of my first day at work. Did she know? I couldn't answer that. I still couldn't answer it. My former colleague connected us with a fraud investigator who worked out of Hamilton. She was thorough and unhurried and explained from the start what they could and couldn't establish. Over the following 3 weeks, she traced the contact with the Mississauga law firm back to correspondence initiated from our son-in-law's personal email account. She found that the notary in Burlington, referenced in the emails, did not appear to hold a valid commission in Ontario. She documented an inquiry made to the Land Registry Office about the Cambridge property that matched the timeline of the emails precisely. She also carefully established that there was no traceable involvement from our daughter in any of the correspondence. When she told me that, I sat in her office and I didn't say anything for a long time. My wife reached over and took my hand. The investigator gave us her completed report on a Thursday afternoon. We had already spoken with our lawyer about next steps. On the Saturday morning, 2 days later, my wife called our daughter and asked if we could come by. We arrived at their house in Cambridge at 11. My son-in-law was home. He answered the door, the way he always answered the door. Easy smile, hand extended. I shook it. I looked at his face while I shook it, and I thought about the word handled in that email. And I kept my expression the way I'd kept it at the retirement party. We sat in their living room. Our daughter brought coffee. My son-in-law sat across from me with his arms on his knees, leaning slightly forward, and I remember thinking that he had always sat that way, like a man performing attentiveness. My wife placed the folder on the coffee table. She said quietly, "We need to talk about some things we found." I watched his face. There was a fraction of a second, a very small window where something moved behind his eyes. And then the smile came back, slightly different now, slightly tighter. "What's this about?" he said. "You know what it's about," my wife said. Our daughter looked from her mother to her husband. "What's going on?" He started with confusion, then he moved to concern, then he moved to indignation. He said he had no idea what we were looking at. He said the emails were taken out of context. He said he had been looking into estate planning options on our behalf because he was worried about us and didn't know how to bring it up. He said the notary in Burlington was just someone he'd spoken to informally. He said the property transfer language was exploratory, not active. He was good at it. I'll give him that. He was calm and his voice was level, and if I hadn't read those emails myself, I might have spent 20 minutes being confused instead of certain. But my wife had been listening to people talk around the truth for 38 years, and she wasn't confused for even a moment. "The signatures are handled," she said, reading from the printout in the folder. "That's what you wrote. What signatures are handled?" He didn't answer that. Our daughter was crying by the time the investigator's report had been laid out on the table. Not from grief, or not only from grief, also from the particular humiliation of having been kept in the dark about something happening inside her own marriage. She hadn't known. The investigator had been right. He had done all of it without her. He left the house that afternoon. Not because we made him leave, because our daughter told him to go. The fraud complaint was filed with the Ontario Provincial Police the following Monday through our lawyer. The case was taken seriously. There was enough documented evidence, the email chain, the false representation to the Waterloo law firm, the correspondence with an impersonator posing as a notary, to proceed. He retained a lawyer. There were months of process ahead of us. I'm not going to describe those months in detail, because they were exhausting and repetitive, and the law moves at its own pace for its own reasons. What I will tell you is that by the following spring, he had entered a guilty plea on 2 counts of fraud-related charges under the criminal code and was facing sentencing. The Cambridge property was never transferred. Our estate documents were reviewed, updated and secured with our actual signatures in our actual presence, with our actual lawyer. Our daughter filed for divorce. That process was also slow and also exhausting and also something I won't detail here. What I will tell you is that she is living now in a house she can afford in Waterloo, 20 minutes from us, and our vegan children come for dinner on Sundays. She and I don't talk about that afternoon in the living room very often. We don't need to. She knows I never doubted her. Not after the investigation, not after the report came back. She knows that the first thing I said to her when it was finally over was not about the money or the property or the legal process. It was about her. People ask me sometimes, not directly but in the way people circle around things, whether I saw it coming, whether there were signs I ignored. And the honest answer is that there were things I noticed and chose to interpret generously. The way he asked questions about our finances that felt like curiosity, but in hindsight had direction to them. The way he occasionally mentioned the Cambridge property in conversations where it didn't quite fit. The way he had, over years, positioned himself as a competent one in situations involving money or paperwork. I noticed those things. I filed them as personality traits, not warning signs, because he was married to my daughter, and she was happy, and I wanted to believe in the version of things that required the least grief. My wife did not make that same mistake. She stood in a bathroom at my retirement party and handed me a phone and let me see what was there, without telling me what to think about it. 38 years. She still knows exactly when to hand me the phone and when to let me figure out myself. I think about what might have happened if she had closed the browser that day, If she had printed the hockey schedule and walked back to the party and never scrolled up to see what was open, we would have gone home that night satisfied. I would have retired. I would have gotten older. And somewhere in a law office in Mississauga, the documentation would have continued taking shape, waiting for the moment it was needed. The photograph my daughter framed, the one from my first day in 1993, is still on the wall in my office at home. She gave it to me because she meant it. That part was real. I held on to that. Something survive. The ones that are real do. I still think about the moment I stood at that bathroom sink and looked at myself in the mirror. Not at the phone. At myself. Because somewhere in those few seconds, I was deciding what kind of man I was going to be about this. Whether I was going to protect my comfort or protect what was actually true. What happened to my wife and me didn't come from nowhere. Liam hadn't walked into our family one afternoon and decided to commit fraud on a whim. It had built slowly, the way these things always do. Small observations about the property value. Casual questions about our retirement accounts that felt like conversation but weren't. Years of positioning himself as the capable one whenever paperwork was involved. The groundwork had been laid carefully, and I had watched it being laid and called it personality. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not his choices. His choices were his to make and he'll carry the weight of them. But my own willingness to interpret things generously when the generous interpretation cost me nothing. It's easy to be discerning about strangers. It's much harder with the people sitting at your dinner table on Christmas Eve. My wife didn't make that mistake. Not because she was suspicious by nature, she isn't, but because she stayed honest with herself about what she was actually seeing. That kind of clear-sightedness is something I've always admired in her, and I understood it better that day than I ever had before. She didn't need the evidence to be airtight before she showed it to me. She just needed it to be real. And it was real. And she showed it to me. And that was enough. There's a version of that afternoon where she closes the browser and says nothing. Where she decides it's not her place, or that she's probably misreading it, or that bringing it up will cause more trouble than it's worth. I understand why a person would make that choice. It would have been the easier choice in the moment. But easy choices that avoid hard truths have a way of collecting interest. What would have looked, in the short term, like keeping the peace would have cost us everything we'd spent 31 years building. What I've come to understand, not as a lesson I read somewhere, but as something I lived, is that the people who come through difficult things intact are not the ones who never got deceived. They're the ones who, when they found out, didn't flinch from what they were looking at. They had the integrity to call it what it was. They had the clarity to think through it carefully, rather than react from panic or grief. And they had the steadiness to see it through, even when the process was slow and expensive and exhausting and involved watching their daughter's marriage end in a conference room in Guelph. Claire is doing well. She's steadier now than she was the year it happened. She comes for Sunday dinners, and the kids do homework at our kitchen table. And it's ordinary in the way that ordinary things are actually the whole point. I have the photograph on my office wall. First day, 1993, standing outside the firm. She gave it to me because she meant it. Some things survive. The ones that were real all along do.